Welcome, Adar. So happy to have you on here. And before we get started, I just wanted to kind of, give folks an opportunity to get to know you and whatever you want to tell about yourself and about the work. And then I'll kind of frame, what I'd like to talk to you about here.
Yeah,
So who are
sure.
you? What you
So
doing?
thanks for having me, Brad. It's great to be speaking to you yet again. I always appreciate our conversation, so it's a privilege to be here with you. Um, so I'm Adar Weinreb. Great to meet you all the viewers and listeners. I live in Israel, currently in the northern Galilee. It's north of Israel. It's a beautiful mountainous area in Israel. Um, just to keep it brief, my day job is in high tech. I work doing something in blockchain technology, very transformative, very interesting industry. Um, but that's not my passion. The passion is what I do on my free time, what I do in the evenings. And that's really work to connect between Israelis and Palestinians. Um, as an Israeli, I'm not reminded of the conflict on a day-to-day basis. I have the privilege of living a relatively good life day to day. I'm reminded of the conflict whenever there's either a terror attack or we have some escalation of violence. Um, but I still don't, even when I'm not reminded of the conflict daily, I'm still not fully at ease knowing that my freedom and my security comes at the expense of another group of people currently, right? It doesn't have to be. There's a way where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side as neighbors, as friends. But currently, under the existing paradigm, my security, my freedom is at the expense of another group of people. So I don't allow myself to forget that in times of peace. Palestinians don't have times of peace. They're reminded of the conflict every single day. So I feel somewhat of an obligation to do what I can to try to make things better. And I don't know how to change full political systems. I don't know how to change who our leadership is, but I do know how to connect between people. I think it's a form of activism that anybody can do, right? You can, as it's as easy as meeting someone on social media and making a friend, right? That's a connection between two people, but the power that has to transform narratives and transform potentially a lifetime of teaching and upbringing and experience can very easily happen over a conversation through social media or on the phone or even in person. So the human to human interaction is one that I truly believe is a powerful and effective form of activism. It's one anybody can do. So that's what I try to uh, do on my free time. And the main way I do it is through a YouTube channel called Sulha. Sulha, Sulh. It means to reconcile in Arabic. And the goal of the YouTube channel is weekly live streams where we bring together Israelis and Palestinians for discussions, debates. Sometimes we do roundtables, sometimes it's a one-on-one interview. And we get amazing results through that channel. And in addition to that, we have a Discord community, which Discord, for those who don't know, it's a messaging slash community management application where we have 1,400 members now, also many Israelis and Palestinians and even Jews and Muslims, all there. A lot of arguing throughout the day, but it's all respectful, all peaceful, and a lot of like strong connections have been built through the Discord community as well. So those are our main two avenues of peace building currently. In time, we do plan to do more in-person stuff. It's just a matter of having the time, capacity, and means to put it together, but all in due time.
Yeah. Well, in another conversation, I've already said this, but I'll say it again here, that I was drawn to when I was doing some of my own research on my own intergenerational trauma and watching videos from different activists, Israeli activists and Jewish activists and Arabic and Palestinian activists. I came across a talk that you gave. I think it was actually at a university in the United States.
It was at UC Irvine. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Southern California. And I have the quote again. I just like to repeat it here, that the path to peace is paved through the humanization of the other. And I was so drawn, first of all, I was drawn by just your presence, but I really got struck by that comment because that's so much aligned with what we're trying to do in NARM. We're trying to do it through psychotherapy and trauma healing, but it just felt there was a lot of alignment. And so I started devouring your content and mostly the videos that you've put on, and we connected and we've had a few conversations. And so I'm just really wanting to really focus a little bit more. You've already brought up a concept around connection. and how so much of your work is driven by meaningful connections between people. And one of the things we talk about from a complex trauma perspective is that connection gets disrupted by unresolved trauma. And it happens in multiple different ways. And it's funny because one of the ways you actually brought up in your last Sulha live stream that you did recently, where you even made a comment about, oh, I should talk to a psychologist about this, because you mentioned the concept of identity and how identity often is one of the obstacles of connection, of humanistic connection. And I might be, butchering your words a little bit, but from my perspective, that's so much the center of developmental and complex trauma. And so I just love to start by hearing kind of your perspective about that, and we can go from there.
Yeah, sure. So is that specifically about identity, or in general, like my thoughts on trauma and how I feel it's potentially affecting the conflict?
Well, I imagine they're probably both related. So wherever you want to start, we can go from there.
Sure. So trauma really is not, I can't say it's an area of expertise of mine, nowhere near to as it is yours, right? But from what it seems, and from the small amount of studies I've read, it shows that trauma affects our ability to feel empathy for other people, which is huge if you want to resolve a conflict, right? It also seems to make us it's hard for us to take a step back out of our trauma and view a conflict objectively, right? We're viewing it as often the victim of this entire story. There's this conflict and I'm the victim of it. It's hard to take yourself away and understand what the other side is feeling, all the factors that are playing into this conflict. So, we often hear that no one knows how to solve a conflict better than those in the conflict, but I feel like that's one of those quotes that sounds nice, because Israelis and Palestinians both have a lot of trauma, a lot, and I don't want to compare whose is worse. I mean, I think it's fair to say Palestinians are worse just by their day-to-day experience, but it's not really about comparing. It's about acknowledging that we're both looking at the conflict through a lens of trauma. And we need to acknowledge that the average Israeli and the average Palestinian is not going to have the best understanding of the conflict, not only for bias of their own upbringing, but also because they're really viewing it as if they're the victim in this whole story, and that there's little they could actually do to change it. So what I'm trying to do, I don't quite know how to heal trauma so well. I do know that psychedelics seem to help, right? That's, I'd say, the area of trauma healing that I'm most experienced with, you could say. So I advocate for the use of psychedelics, but responsible use. It's not for everybody. I must say that. But I'm very interested in actually learning more about trauma, because I understand that one of the best ways to heal the conflict, solve the conflict, is to first heal people's trauma, or heal people's trauma while we're solving the conflict. I don't think you could disconnect these two things. And the more traumatized our populations are, the less equipped we are to deal with it. So while I don't have all the tools to heal people of their trauma, I am trying to help them step out of their current narrative and the bubble they're living in, and kind of view the conflict from another perspective. And that's really where the quote, "The path to peace is paved through the humanization of the other," because we often view the other side as the villains and ourselves as the heroes, right? And I just want people to understand that if they were born on the other side, they would think the same exact thing, just the roles would reverse. They would view the side they're currently on as the villains and themselves as the heroes. So it's such a simple yet powerfully transformative idea people could hold, to take a step out of what they think is true and look at things differently. So again, I'm not sure this is healing people's trauma, but I think it does help them step out of a worldview that trauma is very much keeping them in. I guess that's kind of how I see it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think about the opposite of humanization is dehumanization. And how, I mean, I think I'm hearing you starting to talk about that, about some of these narratives about seeing oneself as the hero and the other as the victim is about a certain, well, in psychology, we talk about objectification, but dehumanization, objectification, kind of the same processes, that we're objectifying a person or a group of people based on our own perspective, our own filters, our own unresolved material. And again, I think the power of what you're trying to create of getting people to come together to sit with the complexity of it all. And I know I talked about this with you last time we met, but to me, I think that's something that is so rare to happen in our conversations, is that we're, at least from the outside, it looks like the intention of your conversations that you're facilitating or having are not to, like, you don't have an agenda to get to some specific place. It seems like the process in itself is the agenda.
Right. Yeah, I'd say that that's a good observation that I don't publicly state too often, because people generally want to watch things based off, like, there's a topic and there's going to be a discussion or debate on the topic. And there's the quote, it's about the journey, not the destination. So I think that might be true about this as well, that the act, regardless of what conclusion is reached from a discussion, the act of an Israeli and Palestinian being able to sit and have a civil discussion about something important to them in itself does tremendous work, and perhaps in healing trauma. I'm not quite sure, but we get messages all the time from people saying that through discovering this channel, they've completely transformed the way they view things. And it's because the average Israeli has never really heard much from a Palestinian, besides what we're taught about Palestinians, besides the most extreme ones we see on social media or hear about on the news, and vice versa. So we don't know much about each other. But here's an opportunity to watch them speak civilly. And that really has an impact on people, as we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. So, you're Israeli. So your friends that on a day-to-day basis that you're connected with, Israeli friends, how do they receive what your efforts are and like what you're doing? I mean, is there resistance? I'm sure there's probably across the board, but like, what's the consensus about how people feel about what you're doing here?
Yeah. So the majority I'd actually say praise the work that I do. Like, when they say avodat kodesh, which means holy work, but it's like a saying in Hebrew. And I don't consider it holy work. I just see it as something important and something I derive immense meaning from. But even most Israelis are fairly right-wing, and they're not involved in the peace process. And even they view it as important. So I'd say there's a majority of Israelis that think this work is, maybe I don't want to use important. I have a feeling many would consider it to be naive, that I think that I could actually have an impact, but they commend the effort, right? Now, again, this is what they say to my face. They might then behind my back speak poorly of me, but when they hear what I do, they compliment it. They seem positive. By and large, I get positive feedback from Israelis. Once in a while, there is some amount of Israelis that are very extreme, and any form of dialoguing and trying to make peace, they would just view it as like insane or stupid, and they may ridicule me. But these aren't the people that I'm meeting day to day. I'd say probably 80% of Israelis seem to be supportive or willing to praise this work, regardless of if they think that it can make a difference or not.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And the thing that I've been curious about, and I'm glad I have this opportunity to ask you a little bit more about, is it seems to me, having watched all of your content pretty much, that Israelis are living in a society where even if they're going against that 20%, there's freedom of speech for the most part. They can show their face on the video, they have their real names, and that's not consistently what's happening with the Palestinians that are on your channel. And so I imagine not only is that percentage not the same, but I'm curious what you've learned about, like, just I mean, I have a lot of questions about this, and I know you're not Palestinian, so you can't answer it, but you have developed these relationships. But for them and the people that are engaging with you, either on Discord or on your channel, coming on live with you, like their part in kind of reaching across the border and making these connections, even when it's not being
Right.
supported by their own people, their own families.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the greatest challenges we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Palestinians, and this is true with Palestinians living on the land, and it's true with Palestinians abroad, that they will often get pushback from their communities for engaging with Israelis. Those living on the land have even greater concern because both Hamas, who rules Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority, who rules the West Bank, arrest Palestinians who interact with Israelis. So we've had friends of ours get arrested and interrogated for speaking with us. Even if like the fear of getting pushback from your neighbors wasn't enough to stop you, fear of the PA or Hamas is enough to stop most Palestinians, which is unfortunate because it doesn't give us nearly enough Palestinian voices. Additionally, Palestinians who do come on the show very much feel the need to appease certain groups. So often I'll like speak to a Palestinian ahead of time on the phone just to get to know them, and then when they'll come on air, they'll be a fair bit more extreme than they were in the phone call. And I know why it is. It's because they don't want to get shit when they're done. And we had a Palestinian come on, and he's a very like nice, agreeable guy, and he lives in New York. You know, he doesn't even live on the land, but he ended up getting kicked out of his dabka class, which is like a Palestinian dance, just for interacting with Israelis. So
Even in New
yeah,
York, you
yeah,
got,
so,
wow.
yeah, and sometimes Westerners are more extreme than people living on the land. Um, this whole concept is called anti-normalization. So the concept of anti-normalization is that you don't normalize with your enemy, right? So Palestinians will say, I'm not going to normalize relations with those oppressing me. And I definitely understand the spirit to this, but there's a wide spectrum of what it means to normalize, right? Some would say normalization is having, for a Palestinian to have an Israeli friends, to meet for hummus, pretend like everything's okay. That would be normalization. Others would say any contact is normalization. Now, most Palestinians seem to, actually, I don't want to say most because I don't know, but there's a lot of Palestinians that would say coming on the channel and debating or speaking in Israeli and sharing our narrative is not normalization, it's activism, right? So there's a camp of people who do not consider that to be normalization, but they still get pushback from the more extreme ones that say any form of communication is just not cool. Now, my question to them is, if we can't speak, then what is left to do? Like the reason often people fight when words aren't enough to solve problems, right? So our ability to communicate with one another is essential, and it's one of the things that could pull us away from more violence. So I really don't understand. I don't understand these people or what their aim is. For them, it's just like until Israel like ceases to exist, or like it's just a very extreme, not realistic perspective as a precondition for peace, which I think gets in the way of us making progress on many things that are very, very attainable.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's unfortunate to see. It's something we're dealing with on a daily basis here.
This is probably a huge stretch, but maybe in some ways it's not. I just think, you're very well aware of, in the United States, there's, some, it's called cancel culture, whatever that means. But the way I look at it is through this lens of attachment, which is really about parents and their children. But of course, attachment becomes the frame of reference about how we have adult relationships. And when parents, when there's failures in attachment or attunement with parents and their children, the research all suggests that it's not about the quantity of how many failures the parents have. It's about the lack of repair after a failure. And I think about that in adult relationships too. It's about when you can't you can't have an intimate adult relationship without making all kinds of mistakes. But that's not the point. The point is, how do we actually learn from those mistakes? It brings in empathy that you brought up before. And I just feel like we're moving in a direction where we're not allowing people to really be in their humanity with each other, which sometimes is very ignorant. We don't know all the information about another person or another culture. So sometimes we're saying things that are very misinformed or sometimes even offensive. And if the reaction is just that at that point, there's no further connection, that's like the worst fear for humans, is to be excommunicated. It's to be pushed away from the group. And so I just was thinking about like how, first of all, how courageous it is for these Palestinians to come on even when they're getting that. But also just like you're saying about this anti-normalization, about how that thinking about like, you know, I mean, first there's this narrative of the enemy, but then there's like that you can't even communicate about the enemy.
Right.
And then that there again brings us back to this issue about humanization, because you're no longer seeing them as a human, you're seeing them as some kind of projection of something that then it's easy to just disconnect from, versus like a person that has complex feelings, complex relationships, and it makes it harder then to fully disconnect from that person.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with what you're saying. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head with probably the biggest problem of cancel culture. And, you know, just to give the topic of cancel culture fair due, some would say it's not cancel culture, it's accountability culture. And I think to an extent, like, you know, the masses holding people accountable, people who may use their platform to spread hate. I think there's merit to that. But I think the aspect of cancel culture that really scares people is kind of like this like mob justice that we see on social media, where people can say the smallest thing and it could be something they said years ago, and then it's brought, you know, they're attacked by thousands of people and it's brought to their employers. And I think it's the fear it creates, right? So you have some people who have their livelihoods affected because of cancel culture, but those people can probably be counted. It's probably a few dozen, a few hundred. I'm not sure the exact number, but the amount of people who fear like they cannot express themselves freely because they'll get excommunicated is likely in the millions. I mean, I get messages from people, like I hear a lot of people who will share with me that they want to speak on certain issues and can't because of repercussions. So the amount of people that live in fear because they don't want to face mob justice is in the millions. And we shouldn't understate the fear of getting excommunicated. Like, we could think from like an evolutionary perspective. As a hunter-gatherer, if you got excommunicated, you died, right? It's like if you did not, and even on like a lower like form of it. I don't want to get too much into like social hierarchies, but there's like a competitive nature, and having the crowd turn against you has other repercussions, not only death, but you know, it biologically speaks to us as like a death, right? And obviously today we're not actually dying from being excommunicated, but it still triggers something very primal in us. Like, I think one of the most consistent fears humans have is like, are they talking bad about me? Are they going to betray me? Like, I think we all have it. I know I have it, right? And I ask myself, where does this even come from? Like, why do I care? And it's something very deep rooted in like we need our communities to survive. So obviously I'm going to be scared that they're turning against me. So yeah, I mean, like, we got to give people space to express themselves, and we need to create a society where we give people the benefit of the doubt, and B, we give people second chances. You know, I think redemption and forgiveness is very important in society, and it's something that it seems like in many social justice spaces particularly, it seems to be lacking. It's you know, it's being held accountable for something you tweeted 10 years ago, and with like no chance for forgiveness. It just seems like that's not the way we should be taking it. It's definitely not in the spirit of like the world I think we should be creating. So yeah, I'm with you on that.
Yeah, and I brought that up because it seems to me, I mean, there's this connection between, living in a society where if you just sit down to have hummus with an Israeli, you could get imprisoned, or worse. And
Right.
like that's an extreme level of cancel that really inhibits just people that like that want to just make some change by sitting down and making connection and learning from other people and being able to like see different sides and hold this larger complexity of the situation. And that is, I mean, it sounds like, that you're inviting a lot of different Palestinians on, and some can't come on or won't come on because of it. And those that do come on, it seems like a high percentage of them really have to alter themselves as a way to protect themselves. So
Right.
they can't fully show up authentically, or even like you gave that example of someone authentically when you were talking to them before you started recording, and then as soon as they started recording, they had to shift a little bit and adjust themselves.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's not something that I see a clear solution to. It's like we got to just deal with this reality as best we could. I think the larger the platform grows, it's going to do two things. One, it's going to put more pressure on Palestinians that come on the show, but it's also going to be more appealing for Palestinians to come on because they see they have a large audience to speak to. So it's gonna be interesting to see how it develops. But the alternative is to just say, fine, if Palestinians won't speak to Israelis because the current situation, the status quo is to put it very lightly, not favorable to Palestinians. But what that does is says we're waiting for our governments to solve the conflict. And then I hear Palestinians or Palestinian supporters say, Palestinians can't do anything to solve the conflict. Israelis need to solve it. They have the power. Okay, well, how do we get Israelis to care about the Palestinian cause? Well, one of the best ways to get them to care about the Palestinian cause is to meet Palestinians and see that they're humans too and that they're suffering, and maybe think twice before you vote for a leader that doesn't care about Palestinians, right? So one of the single best ways to change the voting patterns of Israelis is for Israelis to have more Palestinian friends.
Mm.
And at the very least, more Palestinian acquaintances that have shared with them something about the Palestinian narrative. So I think it's fundamental to changing the attitudes here in Israel. Another approach that many activists take, they said, no, Israelis aren't going to change. We're just going to have the world pressure Israel into changing. And I'm not saying that can't work. I think probably some pressure is probably going to be needed in order to get Israel to make the bold steps necessary to solve the conflict. And let's be clear, Israel can't solve the conflict without Palestinians participating. There's certain things, there's a lot Israel can do, but there's a very simple one that a quite significant portion of the Palestinians, the majority, when I say this, still don't recognize any form of Israel's right to exist. So their precondition for peace is the dismantling of Israel. Well, that's a non-starter for 90 plus percent of Jewish Israelis, I should say. So Palestinians, I do think Israel having the power, Israel being a democracy where people can vote, like the onus is more on us to do something. But at the end of the day, if we don't have, if Palestinians aren't going to come to terms with us existing, then even if we try everything, I don't know if there's much we can do besides dismantle the nation, which we're just not going to do that, right? It might maybe in 100 years after like a lot of shit happens, but it's such a non-realistic, expectation at this point. But people very much think that enough international pressure is enough to get Israel to change. And I think, as I said, I think international pressure can help, but we need to give Israel a path forward that doesn't put Israelis in danger, right? If we want international pressure to help, then the path forward needs to be clear. Yeah. The interesting thing is, it seems like the loudest voices on those saying, do not speak to Israelis, just have the international community pressure Israel, their solution is no Israel. So they essentially want the world to pressure Israel into dismantling themselves, their own institutions. I don't see that happening. Like, that is taking so much energy, so much human effort, right? The activism, that the energy of people that actually care to make a difference is going to an avenue that's not going to yield results. It makes me sad to see. There's a lot that we can achieve. There's a lot that's within the realm of possible. Ending the occupation of the West Bank and creating an independent Palestinian state, that's possible. Improving the relationships between Arab and Jewish Israelis, that's possible. Dismantling Israel seems like just a waste of effort. And I wish we could get people off of that idea. I understand why Palestinians still don't accept Israel's right to exist, like given what they've experienced, given what Israel means to them. Like, I get it, but you know, they're going to need to come to terms, because if we want to solve the conflict, if we want Israel to move, there needs to be a clear path forward. And currently there isn't one.
Yeah, and this is where it brings me into my wheelhouse here with trauma, and specifically intergenerational trauma, because it's a fundamental misunderstanding or lack of recognition of the trauma narrative that has been passed down collectively through the Jewish people, not just over the last 100 years, but for thousands of years, that people have wanted to annihilate or dismantles the language you're using, the Jewish race, the Jewish people. And it hasn't always just been about Israel. I mean, it's, in Germany during the Holocaust, it wasn't about Israel. In the Middle East, when Jews were living in other countries. So I think that this is also a fundamental misunderstanding of the trauma response and what a people will do when someone's meeting them in this objectification, dehumanization. And there's a part of the brain, called the amygdala. I'm sure you've heard of it before. And
yeah, the reptile brain, right?
Yeah. It's part of that whole system about, like, and they found these things called the mirror neurons, which are like, neurons that help us kind of, it has to do with empathy.
Work in groups, right? It's like a social neuron. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Mammals. Exactly. And one of the things that it does is it picks up intentionality from other people. So if I'm walking towards you to want to give you a hug, then there's going to be a certain kind of whole brain response that's going to get triggered, versus if I'm coming over you to, like, sock you in the face. And that intentionality, I think, is really important, because, again, I'm making this very simplistic, but I think the power of your work is that the intention, even though a Palestinian might come on and be like, I just don't agree with this person at all, and they're not going to change my mind. But the intentionality of them to sit down and have a human to human contact and be open to that, I think there's power to rewire the brain and the nervous system that way. And I don't know how you feel, because you're the one often having these or facilitating these, but there seems like when I'm doing, sessions with people that we're starting to shift away from some of these long-term held trauma patterns, there can be some really significant shifts that happen, whether they're cognitive or emotional or in the body or even spiritual. And sometimes I feel like there's moments that's happening in your conversations too. I don't know if this resonates for you at all, but do you feel that?
Yeah, no, I definitely feel like the conversations seem to be having that effect on people. I mean, the messages I get about the transformation this has had on people from both sides of the spectrum, I mean, shows it's doing something. And my impression is it's not just on an intellectual level, right? Like, it's not just learning more facts to give you a better understanding of the conflict. It's seeing your enemy as a human. Mm-hmm. That's not something intellectual. That's something emotional, right? And that's the trauma healing aspect of
exactly.
Yeah. And you brought up an excellent point about dismantling, and I use the word dismantling to soften it, but some would say destroy, and some of the more extreme voices would even say Jews need to leave the land. But I'd say that's probably a fringe at this point. The majority seem to accept us here, just not living under Israel. It would be Palestine or something else. But part of our objection to it also, you could look at it on an intellect level. It's acknowledging that if we don't have a state to defend us and we're a minority, What does that mean for our security, right? That's a rational way to look at it. And there's a very strong rational case to be made, but the fervor in which the dismantling of Israel is rejected is not just the rationale behind it, it's the emotional response it creates. It's the thought of not having someone to protect you. And yeah, I think we do need to understand that element of it as well if we have any hopes to do something here, you know?
Yeah. Do you think sometimes when you're in the middle of these conversations or reflecting on them about the intergenerational trauma on both sides, like is that something that you think about, like how this is getting passed down and this new generation? Because most of the people probably almost all of the people you're having in these conversations weren't there in 1948.
Correct.
They weren't even there in 67 or 73 or maybe even the first intifada, like how this is getting passed down. I wonder what your thoughts about that intergenerational piece.
Yes. So I do think of it, but I'm, admittedly just not an expert on it. So I don't always know what the answer to my questions are. But, I see from personal experience how generational trauma has the ability to heal. And this is, of course, anecdotal, but I look at my grandmother, who's a Holocaust survivor, and you can't talk to her anything Holocaust related. She still won't get in a BMW. No chance of her ever visiting Germany, right? My mom, her daughter, will get in a BMW, Mercedes, maybe even visit Germany, but you could tell how the Holocaust is still a very sensitive issue to her. And then there's the next generation, my generation, and for us, I see how it's much easier for us to talk about it. And even a more lighthearted way, being two generations removed, having time to heal. So, I mean, that's like my experience of seeing how trauma, like each generation away from a horrific event, helps the people heal from that event. But what breaks my heart is how living here in the land, the trauma doesn't fully get to heal because the conflict continues, right? So let's just talk about Jews living here, not Palestinians for a moment. But since the Holocaust, we came here for a haven, right? Then we had the 1948 war, in which 1% of the Jewish population were killed, and since then we've had 4 or 5 other wars and multiple mini conflicts and thousands of terror attacks, right? Each one strikes fear in the hearts and minds of the people, creating new trauma and reinforcing the generational trauma. And Palestinians are experiencing trauma in a very different way, but still for them, it's, more on a daily or weekly basis, having something bad happen to them. And something bad doesn't need to be getting arrested or getting physically harmed. It could just be being humiliated by a soldier. It could be waiting at a checkpoint for a little too long, or getting searched at a checkpoint, or having your home searched on whatever pretense. The humiliation causes also trauma, I believe. And I think that's something that's hard to account, like the psychological effect it plays on the Palestinian people. So yeah, I am constantly thinking of trauma and how it's affecting us, and how it's affecting our ability to perceive the other. But I do actually want to go deeper into it. That's why I really like our conversations. I think I'd even like to become an expert on trauma with time. So, maybe you could be my teacher of sorts.
Happy to. Yeah. I mean, you've taught me a lot through yours, so I'd be happy to pay that back and share together in that. And yeah, I just had as you were talking, I had this kind of flashback or this memory of when I was in Israel, and my Israeli friends were, probably fringe left, right? So very, very radical. Everyone had traveled extensively around the world, and I really enjoyed my relationships. And the people that I was connected with were so open-minded about so many different things, except for one topic. As soon as it got to the Palestinians, it was like they would shift. It was the weirdest thing. It was like we would be having these amazing conversations about Hinduism or whatever, And then as soon as the Palestinian issue became up, it was like literally, it felt like, boom, objectification. The narrative just completely shifted. And that identity piece that like was so strong. And, at that point, we were young. So most of the folks I was hanging out with were probably just a few years out of the military. And so I kind of just chalked it up to the fact that maybe being in the military, they were still shaking some of that off. But I wonder about, you're Israeli, you lived there. I mean, that experience of that.
Yeah. I mean, what you're seeing you're seeing how an otherwise open-minded, rational person gets extremely closed when it comes to a certain topic.
Yeah.
So that'd be interesting if that's because of trauma, like a trauma connected to a topic, they very much change. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people are open-minded until it comes to their enemy, you know, and I think that's at the end of the day what it is. So you have a lot of very open-minded Israelis, and at the same time, they're convinced that the majority of Palestinians want them dead, and they have data and experience to back it up. And when I say data, I don't mean that there's polling showing the majority want us dead, but there's like, when there's a terror attack that kills civilians, we'll see that the terrorist family gets paid. They could hand out candy in the street in Gaza and Ramallah, for example. They'll name a street after that terrorist. So Israelis very much perceive this as, look, they support killing civilians, right? That's what they're doing. When you really understand conflict dynamics, you could understand why they feel a certain way about terrorists. They're just, there's a saying, one person's freedom fighters, another person's terrorist, something like that. Whether it's a freedom fighter or a terrorist really depends on your perspective. And again, I'm by no way justifying harming civilians, but if we understand how an innocent child is born and turns into an adult that thinks it's okay to harm civilians, well, that happens somehow, right? And we should be able to understand how that happens. We're born pure, we're born innocent. It's our environmental conditions that turn us into who we are. And this is something I think people very unfortunately have trouble understanding. We attribute way too much individual agency to a person. And again, giving somebody agency is important because accountability is an important societal force that helps people make better decisions. So I'm all for accountability. But at the end of the day, the decisions you're making are not born, they're not created in a vacuum. They're very much impacted by your environment. And we need to understand this. No one is born a murderer. No one's born a bad person. Your environment turns you into that. And I wish more people would live with that truth, because it makes us so much more empathetic towards those who are most worthy of our empathy, because they've probably had pretty shitty lives,
Yeah.
Yeah. So Israelis it is a huge blind spot. It's like a trigger topic, but I will tell you, in recent years, it seems like, and maybe it's just I've improved my approach for speaking to Israelis, but I'm able to speak to Israelis about the conflict and explain to them how hard it is to be a Palestinian in this conflict, and that we can do more. And they hear that, right? And I view this as a huge, I don't know if it's a change in Israeli society. I don't know if there's more awareness about the Palestinian struggle, or maybe my approach has just improved in a way that they can hear. But I am pretty successful getting this message across to Israelis, even my cousins who are settlers, for example. So, we're getting somewhere. I don't know how to measure it in scale, but we're getting somewhere.
You were talking about the way that environment impacts us. We have this term we use in the NARM work called environmental failure. It's kind of just this larger umbrella term. because in psychology there's been so much a focus on attachment failure, like in the old days psychoanalysis, Freud, the joke was Freud was always blaming the mother and stuff.
Mm,
And so, but there is still this understanding from attachment theory in psychology that like children are being failed by their attachment or their caregivers, their attachment figures, their parents, and then they have to learn how to adapt to those failures. And so we've kind of broadened that some of it is about attachment and caregivers, but a lot of it is also growing up in areas where there's discrimination or war or violence or all kinds of things. So there's like a larger, or the pandemic now, there's like a
right.
larger environmental failure that children aren't getting the security for their optimal development. And so they
Right.
have to start to adapt in different ways. And I was thinking about like, with intergenerational trauma or with the ongoing trauma that's happening, particularly on the Palestinian side, it's like, it's not just that they're being objectified, but there's an internalized objectification too, which is that like we internalize the failure from our environment and make it somehow about us. And then we feel so bad about that, so broken, so defective, so oppressed or whatever, that we can either get stuck in that helplessness and hopelessness, which is a terrible place to be stuck, or we develop some kind of strategy to, we kind of take pride in not being in that way and doing the exact opposite, being powerful, being like, I think of Israel and just like of the way that they have asserted their power since 1948. It's like the internalized objectification of the Jews that came to Israel at that point were just feeling like destroyed people. And yet within one generation, they did quite the opposite. They built a very powerful society. And I think in some ways that makes a lot of sense, but in some ways that is part of the failure and the adaptations, that like, how do you, because that then becomes our identity. Like, no, I'm not weak. I'll never be weak again. Never again will I put myself in this situation. And I can see how on both sides, I was thinking about the people that, like you said, it's like a trigger part. Like you can have an open conversation and then you get to that one area and it triggers. It's like, no, I got to put up my defenses now. I'm not going to allow myself to feel that vulnerability of the fact that like, hey, I'm actually still in an unsafe kind of situation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that fear is often like a base emotion that manifests itself into other emotions or other qualities, you could say. So a lot of the like militaristic pride Israelis have, like the strength,
Mm-hmm.
comes from fear, right?
Yeah.
Like Israelis won't admit that. We'll never say we're scared.
Mm-hmm.
We'll say we're strong. We don't have anything to be scared of. We're strong, but our need to be strong, or our blind support for the military, our inability to criticize, like um, when our military does something wrong, this all, you know, this seems to all be derived from fear of us losing our lives, losing our home, being genocided again. We just don't, it's not expressed as fear, it's expressed as strength and pride. Um, yeah, yeah. And that's very much a part of Israeli identity.
So in terms
Oh,
of in terms of these conversations, Adar, I'm curious specifically about like the role of vulnerability on both sides. Like when people can be real, like what you just said was a very real, like, hey, like this doesn't always work. Sometimes there is fear that like your people are going to annihilate us. Like I'm not going to have a home. My family's going to be destroyed. Like the role of vulnerability in these conversations. I'm curious about how you see that.
yeah, I don't, up until now, I haven't made like a conscious effort to get people to be vulnerable. But now that you mention it, I do think it's it can be a very useful tool to, get sides to see each other if they can, actually share how they're feeling, be vulnerable in front of the other. One potential roadblock there is that sometimes when an Israeli shares their concern, it's Palestinians have a lot of trouble hearing it because of the power imbalance. And then and then the natural response to that is, but how could you compare what you're going through to what I'm going through? And this is something that maybe that's the natural process of a conversation, right? Because then they need to hear that it's not about comparing what we're going through. It's about acknowledging that we're both going through something, and that something, if we could work it out, will be so much closer to solving the conflict. So yeah, I do think maybe I'll find a way to incorporate that into the conversations, a way to get people to be more vulnerable. I would say it seems to naturally come out of people through these conversations. It is often a natural outcome. You know, it's interesting. Like I always say, whenever you see somebody being like very tough and very militant and a lot of pride, they generally are the more insecure people, right? Like that, those people are the most insecure when the perception of them is that they're very, very secure, very confident, but that in many ways is a compensation for something else. That, yeah.
Yeah, I think I said this the last time we talked, but I believe that true strength comes in embracing our vulnerability. It's not that we have to walk around all the time sharing our vulnerability. That's not the point. The point is that we don't have to use all these strategies to run from when we're impacted by something. And in fact, you know, I think one of the ways that we can connect greater to each other is not just sharing our sides of the story, but also understanding the impact that, you know, these situations have had on us. I mean, like, for example, I notice a lot of Israelis on your show will make, and I think you've done this too, actually, maybe like in passing have made comments about like, yeah, I've lost 5 friends and like,
Correct. Yeah.
that,
The five
like,
friends is definitely that's my quote. Yeah.
that's your quote. Okay. Yeah. But
Because
people do
that's
that. But
that's the
people do.
amount. Yeah.
Yeah. People do that a lot. And it's like, I almost want you to like slow down in that moment and be like, you've lost 5 friends by, you know, terrorist attacks, like the impact that that's had on your life. I mean, you're having a fine life still, but
Right.
the impact of the fact that one day your friend was there and you could connect with them and the next day they weren't because someone decided to take their life in the name of something like, you know, like there, it just seems like slowing down on both sides. There could be a lot to really connect around, you know,
Yeah,
the
that's a good
pain.
point. That's a good point. Yeah, you know, I kind of say it in passing, but yeah, I don't
Well,
really express what that means to me. You know, it's interesting. I feel like as a host, because when I'm hosting these conversations, I try to like give people a calm feel. So I think I'm less likely to show my vulnerable side when I'm hosting. And maybe that's to a fault. Maybe I should. I feel like though when I'm with friends or something, it's and this is something I've worked on for years. I think men in society, it's like anti-vulnerable. I think the whole vulnerability thing is not just relevant to Israel Palestine, but
yes.
men in general, I think
Yeah.
need to work on being vulnerable.
Yeah.
And even in front of their other guy friends, I think it's
Mhm.
very powerful. So me and my close guy friends, we have a thing where we share with each other how we're feeling.
Mm.
We'll be very open in expressing if someone did something like if a friend does something that bothered me, we'll talk about it. We'll understand like how that happened, why it affected me, if it's affecting me because of some pre-existing thing that happened. And these are like, this is not common to hear men having these conversations, but they're very much therapeutic.
And support humanization and connection.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's true. As a host, I rarely do that. Like it's almost like I don't want to say it's a facade I have. It's definitely I'm acting my natural self, but I don't show all sides of myself at any given moment. And the vulnerable side, I need to ask myself why I'm less likely to show that when I'm hosting. There could be benefit to being vulnerable on air. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I imagine some people wouldn't give you consent to to go in that direction. They just wouldn't want to do that. But it seemed, and maybe that's not the role of your position on these live streams, but maybe there's some kind of other psychotherapeutic or ritual or something where people can get together and really share, you know,
Yeah.
the impact of that, you know, because again, one of the things I think that humanizes is you've lost 5 friends, and then you're talking to a Palestinian and they've lost a certain amount of friends too. Like that's already something shared in common. Just like
Right.
if your mother had cancer and their mother had cancer, that's something to
Right.
share in common.
Yeah, I'm trying to, yeah, yeah. There's, so the five friends I've lost, they're people that every single one of them I knew from the army, but not all of them died while serving. Some two died in actual terrorist attacks, and three died in armed combat. What's interesting, and this is a side note, this in no way negates what you're saying, because I do think it's important to have groups of people where they're sharing their suffering, and it shows their commonality. But it's going to take time for Palestinians to be sad over Israeli soldiers dying, the same way it's going to take time for Israelis to feel any empathy towards Palestinian terrorists dying. Um, there are some groups working on this. So every Yom HaZikaron, which is Israel's Remembrance Day, which is a very sad day because every single Israeli has lost someone. Um, there's this one gathering every year for Yom HaZikaron that is done with the bereaved families of Israelis and Palestinians.
Wow.
And I've attended this, and that to me is the most powerful way to really commemorate the dead, by doing it with your perceived enemy in quotations, because that's not how we should view the other side. But the pushback to this conference is you're there commemorating the death of Israelis with the death of Palestinian terrorists, right? So Israelis they struggle with that because some of the Palestinians who were killed while attacking Israel in one way or another. That to me makes no difference in the world for two reasons. One, if you were born Palestinian, you very likely would understand why that individual decided to attack Israelis in one way or another. And two, the pain of losing a loved one doesn't hurt any less if that person was killed attacking Israel or killed some other way. It's a loss of a loved one, right? The parents' pain is no different. And healing that pain through commemorating the death together with your enemy is extremely powerful and extremely healing. I think it's beautiful, and it's something we need to do more of. And there was one in Tel Aviv, and a few thousand people attended, right? So it's not like a tiny group like this. There's people who see the value in this, but there's immense pushback. It's viewed as like a far left commemoration, right? When it should seem like a very normal way to commemorate, the way, Yeah.
Again, it feels aligned with kind of the mission that you're on here is to kind of bring those connections together, and just the shared humanity of that. And it's really not about even the people that were lost. It's about the generations here and to follow that we're trying to do something different.
Right. Yeah, every generation is another opportunity to to pull the world into a positive trajectory. The problem is every generation is born to parents of the previous,
that is the challenge.
But this is a cycle where slowly, we see improvements from generation to generation, and sometimes there's pullbacks, right? I'd say if you look at like the polling across the board, I think the younger generation of Israelis and Palestinians are not more open-minded than their parents. The data is conflicting, but there's some, I would say, data showing that the younger generations are more extreme, which again, it's not hard to understand why. Prolonged conflict, less hope, more despair. Despair breeds extreme behavior. So, we can understand how this came to be. The question is, what can we do now to change it? And again, I'll go back to where we started. The single best way I know to make a difference is to just work on the humanization process, to stop viewing them as our enemy, to stop fearing them, to understand that the biggest difference between them is just the side of an imaginary line we were born on.
Yeah.
And if we could acknowledge that, that's step one into healing our trauma, and an important step towards solving the conflict.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw a video that you put up recently that you were cleaning up cigarette butts in Jerusalem with, and first of all, I just want to say how respectful it was of you that you were like putting your phone down when you were walking by people just to make sure you weren't capturing their faces and stuff. But just the energy of that to me was so powerful. Like just getting together, doing something for the environment, or even if it wasn't even for the environment, just to have coffee together or whatever. Those kind of conversations for me are where the hope happens. And I know people are urgent, of course, and desperate to make change happen right away. But I really think, going back to the right beginning of this conversation and to how I connected to you, the path to peace is really paved on humanization. And those one-on-one connections, I don't think we should minimize. I mean, of course, it's nice to have thousands of people showing up. But I just really think that we're going to have more conversations about solution-oriented stuff at some point, I'm sure, because I know you have ideas, and I'm sure I have ideas somewhere too. But I think this is a great starting point of just like really taking some time to understand the power of even just what we're doing now, of having these conversations. And
amen.
Yeah.
Amen. And by the way, just a shout out, the organization that put together that cleanup in Jerusalem, it's the Home, which is a Jerusalem-based NGO that really focuses on solving conflict. What's interesting about them, though, most of its members are right-wingers, like they're nationalist Israelis, but they understand that there's no future here without Palestinians, so we got to make it work out. And I very much support organizations. I have a fair bit of ideological differences with myself and most members of the Home, but I work with them because, people sometimes ask me, they said, Israel is so right wing. How do we move them to the left? And I think a better question is not necessarily how you move them to the left, but how you get them involved in the peace process. Because there's nothing about being right wing that means you can't be part of the humanization process. That means you can't support a peaceful solution. So I think we don't necessarily need to change where people orient themselves on the political spectrum, rather just understand that even where they're at, they can still be an agent for change, for positive change. And I work with a lot of right wingers who are quite different from myself ideologically, because they are the majority of the country, and without them, we don't have a solution. So I think that's important.
Yeah. And there's at least one person I've seen on your channel that talks about how his belief is that those are the people that actually need to start having the conversations the most extreme, both on the Israeli and Palestinian side, which makes a lot of sense, actually, if that can happen.
Yeah, if they'd be willing to speak, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Well, anything else you want to, as we wrap up, any shout outs to the projects you're doing, or?
Just, it's been a great pleasure, Brad. If anybody listening or viewing wants to get in touch, maybe Brad, you could put like my link tree or something in the description, as well as come check us out on YouTube. We're doing something every week, very interesting conversations, and I'm very open to feedback and suggestions and criticism. So don't hesitate to reach out, share your thoughts. And yeah, Brad, thank you. I'd love to do this again sometime.
Yeah, me too. Appreciate all of our conversations. So thanks.